Picture this: March 30th, 1993. A desolate stretch of California desert. An on-ramp to Interstate 10 near Desert Center, one of the most remote locations you can imagine. And there, in the unforgiving heat and isolation, a discovery that would haunt law enforcement for nearly 3 decades. A body, a mother of 4, a woman who should have been home in Tulare, California, more than 100 miles away. Instead, she's here, on this lonely piece of highway, the victim of a brutal crime that investigators couldn't solve. For 30 years, her killer walked free. For 30 years, her children grew up without answers. For 30 years, this cold case sat in filing cabinets, waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for one crucial break, waiting for justice. What if I told you that the man responsible had been hiding in plain sight all along? A truck driver, crisscrossing America's highways for over 4 decades, potentially leaving a trail of victims from Texas to California and beyond. When his arrest finally came, it shocked everyone who knew him. But for investigators, it was the culmination of decades of patience, preserved evidence, and the relentless march of forensic science. This is the story of Sherri Herrera. This is the story of how one DNA match connected 2 murders across state lines. And this is the story of how a cold case, 3 decades old, finally got its day in court. Her name deserves to be remembered. Her story deserves to be told. And her killer? He's about to face everything he thought he'd escaped. Let me introduce you to Sherri Herrera. Not as a victim, not as a case number, but as a person, as a mother, as someone who mattered. Sherri was 30 years old in 1993. 30 years old. Think about that for a moment. At 30, most people are just hitting their stride, building careers, raising families, looking forward to decades of life ahead. Sherri had all of that. She was a mother to 4 children, for kids who depended on her, who loved her, who needed her every single day. She lived in Tulare, California, a city in the San Joaquin Valley known for its agricultural roots and tight-knit community. Tulare isn't a big city. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where families put down roots for generations. Sherri was part of that fabric. She wasn't someone who disappeared into anonymity. She was known. She was loved. She was present in her children's lives. Friends and family members would later describe Sherri as devoted to her kids. That's what mattered most to her. Being a mother wasn't just something she did, it was who she was. For children, each one a piece of her heart walking around outside her body. She had dreams for them, plans for their futures, hopes that any mother has when she looks at her children and sees endless possibility. We don't know all the details of Sherri's daily life, the small moments that made up her routine. Did she sing along to the radio while driving? Did she have a favorite meal she cooked for her kids? What made her laugh? What kept her up at night? These are the details that get lost when someone becomes a victim, when their life gets reduced to a case file and a date of death. But these details mattered. Sherri's life mattered, not because of how it ended, but because of how she lived it. On March 30th, 1993, Sherri's day started like any other. Or maybe it didn't. We don't know exactly what circumstances led her away from Tulare that day. We don't know if she was traveling voluntarily, if she was coerced, if she was meeting someone, or if something went terribly wrong along the way. What we do know is that somehow, someway, Sherri ended up over 100 miles from home, in one of the most isolated stretches of California desert you can imagine. Desert Center sits in Riverside County, east of Palm Springs, in an area where civilization gives way to vast expanses of sand, rock, and scrub brush. Interstate 10 cuts through this landscape, a ribbon of asphalt connecting Southern California to Arizona and points east. It's a route used by thousands of travelers every day. Families on road trips, vacationers heading to the coast, and truck drivers, long-haul truck drivers, carrying freight across state lines, spending days and weeks away from home, stopping at truck stops and rest areas, moving through America's highway system like blood through veins. The eastbound Hayfield Road on-ramp to Interstate 10 is exactly the kind of place you'd drive past without thinking twice. An on-ramp, a merge point, A place where vehicles accelerate to join the flow of highway traffic. It's not a destination. It's not even really a location. It's just a spot on the map, a geographic coordinate that most people would never remember. But for Sherri Herrera, it became the last place she'd ever be. On that March day in 1993, something happened on that on-ramp. Something violent, something fatal. And when her body was discovered there, it set in motion an investigation that would span 3 decades, cross multiple states, and eventually expose a killer who thought he'd gotten away with murder. Sherri left behind for children, for kids who would grow up with a hole in their lives that nothing could fill. Imagine being one of those children. Maybe you're old enough to remember your mother, to hold on to fragments of memories. The sound of her voice, the way she hugged you, the last time you saw her. Or maybe you're young enough that your memories are more like ghosts, impressions of a person you knew but can't quite hold on to. Either way, you're growing up knowing that your mother was taken from you, stolen, and that the person who did it is out there somewhere, living their life while yours has been irreparably shattered. For 30 years, those children carried that weight. For 30 years, they lived with unanswered questions. Who killed their mother? Why? Was it random? Or did the killer know her? Was he caught for something else, sitting in prison somewhere, his connection to Sherri's murder unknown? Or was he free, walking around, maybe living a normal life, maybe even having a family of his own? These are the questions that haunt the families of cold case victims. The not knowing, the wondering, the hoping that someday, somehow, there will be answers. Because without answers, there's no closure. Without closure, there's no way to move forward. You're stuck in that moment, frozen in time, unable to process grief because the story has no ending. Sherri Herrera's story does have an ending now, but it took 30 years to get there. 30 years of waiting, 30 years of advances in forensic science, 30 years of preserved evidence and dedicated investigators who refused to let the case be forgotten. And when the ending finally came, when the answers finally emerged, they came from a place no one expected. Not from California, not from Tulare, but from Texas. From an arrest in a different case that would blow this cold case wide open and finally give Sherri's family the justice they'd been waiting for since 1993. March 30th, 1993. The date is burned into the case file. The date everything changed for Sherri Herrera and her family. We need to talk about what happened that day, and more importantly, about what we don't know. Because the truth is, there are gaps in this story. Significant gaps. And those gaps matter because they represent the moments before Sherri's death, the circumstances that put her in harm's way, the chain of events that led from her home in Tulare to a desolate on-ramp in Riverside County. Sherri lived in Tulare. That's established. Tulare is in the heart of California's Central Valley, surrounded by agricultural land, about halfway between Fresno and Bakersfield. It's inland, far from the coast, settled deep in California's farming country. Desert Center, where Sherri's body was found, is in Riverside County, east of the Coachella Valley, in the Colorado Desert. If you're driving from Tulare to Desert Center, you're looking at roughly 2 hours, maybe a bit more, depending on your route and traffic. You'd take Highway 99 south, then catch Interstate 10 heading east. It's not a trip you'd make by accident. It's not a wrong turn or a slight deviation. It's a journey. So the question becomes, why was Sherri there? What took her from Tulare to that specific spot on that specific day? Was she traveling with someone? Was she offered a ride? Did she know her killer? Or was this a chance encounter, a moment of vulnerability that a predator exploited? These questions haunted investigators in 1993, and to some extent, they're questions that may never be fully answered. What we know is that Sherri ended up on that on-ramp, and that's where her life ended. Let that sink in for a moment. An on-ramp, not a rest area, not a parking lot, not someone's home. An on-ramp to a major interstate highway. Think about the dynamics of that location. On-ramps are transitional spaces. You're accelerating, merging into traffic, moving from one place to another. They're not places where people typically stop. They're not destinations. So if Sherri was killed on that on-ramp, it suggests a few possibilities. Maybe she was in a vehicle that pulled over there. Maybe there was an argument, a confrontation, something that escalated. Maybe she was trying to get away, trying to escape, and that on-ramp was as far as she got. Or maybe her body was placed there after she was killed elsewhere, dumped in a location that was remote enough to delay discovery but visible enough that she'd eventually be found. Each scenario paints a different picture, and without witnesses, without someone who saw what happened, investigators had to work with what they had: the crime scene itself and the evidence it contained. When Sherri's body was discovered, law enforcement responded immediately. Riverside County Sheriff's Department investigators arrived at the scene, and what they found was deeply disturbing. This wasn't a natural death. This wasn't an accident. This was a homicide, and the evidence suggested it was accompanied by sexual assault. The brutality of the crime was evident. Sherri had been attacked, violated, and killed. The person who did this had left her on that on-ramp and driven away, probably merging onto Interstate 10 and disappearing into the flow of traffic. Just another vehicle among thousands. But here's the thing. The killer made a mistake. Maybe they didn't realize it at the time. Maybe they thought they'd been careful. But they left something behind. Something invisible to the naked eye but invaluable to investigators. They left DNA. In 1993, DNA analysis was still relatively new to criminal investigations. The first use of DNA to solve a crime had only happened a few years earlier in the late 80s. It was cutting-edge technology, expensive and time-consuming, not yet the standard tool it would become. But investigators at the Sherri Herrera crime scene recognized the importance of collecting biological evidence. They followed protocol. They documented everything. They collected samples from Sherri's body and from the scene. They preserved that evidence, storing it properly, maintaining the chain of custody, doing everything by the book. And then they waited. They waited for test results. They waited for leads. They waited for a suspect to emerge. The DNA evidence from the crime scene was processed, creating a profile of the person who had left biological material on Sherri's body. But here's the problem. A DNA profile is only useful if you have something to compare it to. In 1993, there was no massive database of DNA profiles from criminals across the country. CODIS, the combined DNA index system that would eventually become the FBI's national DNA database, was just being developed. It wouldn't be fully operational until 1998. So investigators had a DNA profile from the crime scene, but no one to match it to. They pursued other leads. They interviewed people. They looked at Sherri's life, her connections, anyone who might have had a reason to harm her. They investigated the possibility that this was random, a crime of opportunity committed by a stranger. They checked with truck stops in the area, knowing that Interstate 10 was a major trucking route and that transient criminals often used the anonymity of the highway system to commit crimes and then move on before they could be caught. But nothing panned out. No witnesses came forward. No one saw anything suspicious on that on-ramp. No one reported seeing Sherri with anyone. There were no obvious suspects, no clear motive, no trail to follow. The investigation, despite the best efforts of dedicated detectives, began to slow. Not because anyone gave up, but because there was simply nowhere left to go. Every lead had been exhausted. Every possibility had been explored. The case was hitting a wall. And then, inevitably, the case went cold. Not forgotten, but inactive. The file was marked as an unsolved homicide. The evidence was stored. And Sherri Herrera's name joined the ranks of thousands of other cold case victims across America. People whose murders remain unsolved, whose killers remain free, whose families remain in limbo, waiting for answers that may never come. But even in those early days, even as the case cooled and moved to the back burner, there was one thing working in favor of justice. One thing that would prove crucial decades later. The DNA evidence was preserved. It sat in storage, maintained at the proper temperature, cataloged and secured. Waiting, because investigators knew, even then, that technology would continue to advance. They knew that what seemed impossible in 1993 might become routine in 20 years or 30. They knew that as long as that evidence existed, there was hope. And hope, it turns out, was not misplaced. Because 3 decades later, that preserved DNA evidence would be the key that unlocked everything. It would connect Sherri's murder to a man who had been living free, driving trucks across America, potentially committing other crimes, thinking he'd escape justice. It would bring closure to a family that had waited 30 years for answers. And it would prove that, in the pursuit of justice, time doesn't always run out. Sometimes it's on your side. Let's talk about what it means to investigate a homicide in 1993, especially one that occurs in a remote location with no immediate witnesses and no obvious suspects. Because understanding the limitations investigators faced back then helps us appreciate just how remarkable it is that this case was eventually solved. When Riverside County Sheriff's Department detectives arrived at the Hayfield Road on-ramp, they were walking into a crime scene that posed significant challenges. First, the location itself. An on-ramp in the middle of the desert isn't like a crime scene in an urban area where there are houses nearby, security cameras, potential witnesses looking out windows. This was isolated. The nearest town, Desert Center, is barely a town at all. More of a spot on the map with a tiny population. The surrounding area is harsh desert landscape, sparsely populated, with long stretches between any signs of civilization. The detectives processed the scene methodically. They photographed everything. They measured distances. They noted the position of Sherri's body, the condition of her clothing, any signs of a struggle. They searched for physical evidence. Fibers, hairs, anything that might have transferred from the killer to the victim or vice versa. They collected the biological evidence that would later prove crucial, carefully packaging and labeling each sample. But physical evidence is only one part of an investigation. Detectives also need context. They need to understand the victim's life, their routine, their relationships. So investigators began building a profile of Sherri Herrera. They spoke with her family in Tulare, trying to piece together her movements on March 30th. Where was she supposed to be that day? Who did she interact with? Was anything unusual happening in her life? Were there any threats, any conflicts, any reason someone might want to harm her? They also had to consider the possibility that this was a stranger killing, a random act of violence committed by someone Sherri had never met. And if that was the case, the suspect pool was potentially enormous. Think about Interstate 10. It runs from Santa Monica, California, all the way to Jacksonville, Florida. It's a major cross-country route, used by countless travelers every single day. Truck drivers use it constantly, moving freight between the West Coast and the rest of the country. Any one of them could have been passing through the Desert Center area on March 30th, 1993. Investigators reached out to truck stops along the Interstate 10 corridor. They checked records from weigh stations. They asked if anyone remembered seeing anything unusual on or around March 30th. Did any drivers mention picking up a hitchhiker? Did anyone report suspicious behavior? Did any truck stop employees notice someone who seemed agitated or nervous? The responses were discouraging. In a transient community like long-haul trucking, where drivers are constantly moving, where faces change daily at every truck stop, where anonymity is easy to maintain, finding one person who might have passed through on one specific day is like finding a needle in a haystack. And without a specific suspect to focus on, investigators were essentially asking, did you see anyone suspicious? At locations where hundreds of people passed through daily, the DNA evidence offered hope, but limited hope. The profile existed, but there was nothing to compare it to. Investigators could submit the profile to databases as they came online, but those databases were small in the early 90s. They contained DNA from known offenders in certain jurisdictions, but there was no guarantee that Sherri's killer had ever been arrested anywhere, let alone in a place that had collected and uploaded DNA data. So investigators did what they could with the tools available. They followed up on every tip, no matter how unlikely. They re-interviewed witnesses multiple times, hoping someone might remember a detail they'd initially overlooked. They looked at similar crimes in the region, checking if there were patterns, other unsolved homicides that might share characteristics with Sherri's murder. Serial offenders often have recognizable patterns. They select similar victims, use similar methods, operate in similar locations. If Sherri's killer had struck before or would strike again, maybe those connections would become visible. But months passed without a breakthrough. Then years. The lead detective on the case likely retired or moved to other assignments. New detectives took over, reviewing the file periodically, looking for something that earlier investigators might have missed. Each time the case was reviewed, the conclusion was the same. Without new information, without a witness coming forward, without a suspect to compare the DNA to, there was nowhere to go. And here's the brutal reality of cold cases. It's not that investigators don't care. It's not that they give up. It's that they run out of investigative avenues. When every lead has been followed to its conclusion, when every person of interest has been cleared, when every piece of evidence has been analyzed and yields no new information, the case doesn't close, but it becomes inactive. It sits in a file cabinet, waiting for something to change, waiting for new technology, waiting for a witness to come forward, waiting for the killer to make a mistake. For Sherri's family, this waiting period must have been agonizing. Imagine living year after year, knowing that the person who killed your mother, your daughter, your loved one, is out there somewhere. Maybe they're living a normal life. Maybe they have a job, a family, friends. Maybe they think about what they did sometimes in quiet moments and feel remorse. Or maybe they don't think about it at all. Maybe Sherri was just one victim among others. A crime they committed and moved on from without a second thought. The family had to navigate their grief without closure. How do you mourn someone when you don't have answers? How do you move forward when the story has no ending? Birthdays came and went. Holidays. Anniversaries of Sherri's death. Her children grew up. They went to school, made friends, fell in love, maybe had children of their own. All the things Sherri would never get to see. And through it all, the question hung in the air. Would they ever know who did this? Would there ever be justice? In Tulare, in Sherri's community, people remembered. Small communities don't forget their tragedies. They carry them generation after generation. Sherri's murder became part of the town's history, a reminder that violence can reach anywhere, that safety is never guaranteed. People who knew Sherri told stories about her, keeping her memory alive. And they wondered, just like her family wondered, if the case would ever be solved. Meanwhile, in Riverside County, the evidence sat in storage, carefully preserved, properly maintained. The DNA profile was in the system, entered into databases as they came online, automatically compared against new profiles as they were added. It was a passive process, but it was happening. Every time a new offender's DNA was collected and uploaded, the system would run comparisons against unsolved cases. Millions of comparisons, running in the background, searching for matches. And for years there were no hits, no matches, nothing that connected the DNA from Sherri's case to any known individual. The killer, whoever they were, had either never been arrested, or they'd been arrested in a jurisdiction that hadn't collected DNA, or their crimes had occurred before DNA collection became standard procedure. They were in the system's blind spot, invisible to the very technology that should have identified them. But then something changed. Not in California. Not in Riverside County. The change came from Texas. From an arrest that had nothing to do with Sherri Herrera, nothing to do with California, nothing to do with Interstate 10 or Desert Center or 1993. An arrest in a different case for a different murder in a different state. An arrest that would finally, after nearly 30 years, connect the dots and expose a killer who thought he'd escaped justice. Remember that detail because we'll be coming back to it. The break in Sherri's case didn't come from solving Sherri's case. It came from solving someone else's. And that's the thing about cold cases in the DNA era. You never know when or where the answer is going to appear. You just have to be patient. You just have to wait for the system to do its work. And you have to make sure the evidence is preserved, because without that evidence, even the most sophisticated database in the world can't help you. 30 years. That's how long the wait lasted. 30 years of preserved evidence, advancing technology, and dedicated investigators who refused to let Sherri Herrera be forgotten. And when the break finally came, when the DNA match was finally made, it would reveal a killer whose crimes spanned states and decades. A man who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, driving America's highways, living a seemingly normal life, all while carrying the secret of at least 2 murders and possibly more. 3 decades. Let's really think about what that means. 30 years of waiting. 30 years of unanswered questions. 30 years of a family living with a hole in their lives that nothing could fill. When Sherri Herrera was murdered in 1993, her youngest child might have been a toddler, maybe not even old enough to form lasting memories of their mother. Her oldest might have been approaching their teenage years, old enough to remember everything, old enough to feel the full weight of the loss. These children grew up in the shadow of their mother's unsolved murder. They went through school without her. They graduated without her in the audience. They experienced first loves, heartbreaks, achievements, and failures without being able to call their mom and talk about it. Think about all the milestones that happen over 30 years. Sherri's children became teenagers, then adults. They might have graduated from college, started careers, gotten married. They might have had children of their own, making Sherri a grandmother she'd never get to be. All of those moments were marked by absence, by the awareness that someone crucial was missing, someone who should have been there to celebrate, to offer advice, to just be present. And through all of it, the question never went away. Who killed their mother? Why? And would they ever find out? For the investigators who worked the case, the passage of time brought its own frustrations. The original detectives who responded to the scene in 1993 likely retired long before the case was solved. They moved on to other cases, other investigations, eventually leaving law enforcement altogether. But Sherri's case stayed with them. Cold case detectives will tell you that unsolved cases haunt them, that they think about the victims, wonder if there was something they missed, some angle they didn't pursue, some question they didn't ask. As the years passed, the case was periodically reviewed. This is standard procedure for cold cases, especially homicides. Agencies will assign investigators to go through old files, looking at them with fresh eyes, checking if any new forensic techniques might be applicable, seeing if any new information has come to light. Each time Sherri's case was reviewed, the investigators would have read through the original reports, studied the crime scene photos, examined the evidence log, and each time they would have reached the same conclusion. The DNA evidence was solid, but without a match, there was nothing to pursue. The DNA profile from the crime scene sat in databases waiting. As CODIS expanded, as more states joined the system, as more offender profiles were uploaded, Sherri's case DNA was automatically compared against each new entry. This is one of the most powerful aspects of DNA databases. They're not static. Every time a new profile is added, it's compared against every unsolved case in the system. So even though investigators weren't actively working Sherri's case on a daily basis, the case was never truly dormant. It was always there, waiting for the right match to appear. But years turned into decades with no hits. The killer's DNA wasn't in the system. Or if it was, it hadn't been properly matched yet due to technical limitations or database errors or simple bad luck. The absence of a match didn't mean the killer hadn't been arrested for something else. It just meant that their DNA hadn't been collected, or hadn't been entered into CODIS, or was in a different database that didn't share information with California's system. During these cold case years, from 1993 through the early 2000s and into the 2010s, forensic science was evolving rapidly. DNA analysis became faster, cheaper, and more sophisticated. Techniques that required large samples in the 90s could be performed on microscopic traces by the 2000s. Familial DNA searching became possible, allowing investigators to find suspects through their relatives' DNA. Genetic genealogy emerged as a tool, using public DNA databases and family tree research to identify suspects who had never been arrested. Each new development in forensic science offered hope for cold cases like Sherri's. Agencies began forming dedicated cold case units, teams of investigators whose sole focus was reviewing unsolved cases and applying new techniques. The Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team was one such unit. These detectives specialized in old cases, understanding that solving them required different skills than working fresh investigations. They had to interpret reports written by investigators who might be retired or deceased. They had to work with evidence that had been stored for decades. They had to track down witnesses whose memories had faded or who had moved away years ago. But they also had advantages that the original investigators didn't have. They had access to more advanced forensic techniques. They had larger DNA databases. They had more computing power for analyzing data and finding patterns. And they had something else. They had time to be thorough, to approach the case methodically, without the pressure of a fresh crime scene and a ticking clock. For Sherri's family, the formation of cold case units offered a glimmer of hope. It meant that someone was actively looking at their loved one's case again, that Sherri wasn't forgotten. Cold case detectives often reach out to victims' families, letting them know the case is being reviewed, asking if they have any new information, offering reassurance that the pursuit of justice continues even decades after the crime. These conversations are bittersweet. On one hand, it's comforting to know someone still cares, that the case hasn't been closed or filed away permanently. On the other hand, it reopens wounds, brings back painful memories, forces families to relive the worst day of their lives. And there's always the risk of disappointment. What if the review doesn't yield any new leads? What if it's just another dead end? But families of cold case victims learn to live with hope and disappointment simultaneously. They learn to mark time differently than other people. For them, time isn't measured in years, but in anniversaries of the death, in birthdays the victim never saw, in holidays celebrated without them. Every March 30th, Sherri's family remembered the day she was taken from them. Every Mother's Day was a reminder of absence. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every ordinary Tuesday that would have been unremarkable if Sherri were still alive, was tinged with loss. And the cold case years are particularly cruel because they're characterized by inaction. Not because anyone has given up, but because there's nothing to do. The evidence has been collected and analyzed. The witnesses have been interviewed. The leads have been exhausted. All that's left is waiting. Waiting for technology to advance. Waiting for someone with information to come forward. Waiting for the killer to make a mistake. Just waiting. The waiting happened against a backdrop of societal changes. In 1993, the internet was in its infancy. Cell phones were rare and expensive. There was no social media, no widespread digital surveillance, no networks of traffic cameras and security footage. By the time Sherri's case was solved in the 2020s, the world was fundamentally different. Communication was instant. Information was everywhere. Privacy had eroded in ways unimaginable in the 90s. These changes affected how crimes were investigated, but they didn't necessarily help with crimes that occurred before the digital age. Cold case investigators working in the 2010s and 2020s had to navigate this divide. They were using modern techniques to solve crimes that occurred in a pre-digital world. They couldn't pull cell phone records from 1993 because cell phones were uncommon. They couldn't check social media because it didn't exist. They couldn't review traffic camera footage because those systems weren't deployed yet. They had to work with what the original investigators had collected: witness statements, physical evidence, and crime scene documentation. And in Sherri's case, the most valuable thing they had was that DNA profile, carefully preserved, waiting for its moment. During these decades, Douglas Thomas, though investigators didn't know his name yet, was living his life. He was working as a truck driver, a job he'd held for over 40 years. He was driving cross-country routes, spending days or weeks away from home, stopping at truck stops and rest areas, delivering freight, then moving on to the next job. It was a solitary profession in many ways, a life spent on the road, in constant motion, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots or form lasting connections. For someone with dark secrets, trucking was an ideal profession. It offered anonymity. It offered mobility. It offered an alibi for being anywhere at any time. If Douglas Thomas committed crimes along his routes, who would connect them? A murder in Texas one year, a murder in California the next. Unless someone was specifically looking for patterns, unless someone realized these crimes might be connected, they'd just be isolated incidents in different jurisdictions, investigated by different agencies, filed away as separate unsolved cases. But the thing about DNA evidence is that it doesn't care about jurisdictional boundaries. It doesn't matter if a crime happens in Texas or California or anywhere else. DNA is DNA. And once a profile is in the system, it's searchable nationwide. All it takes is one arrest, one sample collected from the suspect, one entry into CODIS, and suddenly every unsolved case with DNA evidence becomes a potential match. That's what investigators were waiting for, though they didn't know it. They were waiting for Douglas Thomas to make a mistake. Not in California. Not in relation to Sherri Herrera's case. but somewhere, sometime, in a way that would put his DNA into the system and trigger the match that would finally connect him to the murder on that desolate on-ramp in 1993. And when that mistake finally came, when Thomas was arrested in Texas for an entirely different murder, the decades of waiting would finally come to an end. Justice was about to catch up with a killer who thought time had granted him immunity. 2022. Nearly 3 decades after Sherri Herrera's murder. The break came not from California, not from years of painstaking detective work in Riverside County, but from Texas. From an arrest that initially had nothing to do with Sherri's case. From a moment when law enforcement in a completely different state took a man into custody, collected his DNA as part of standard booking procedure, and set in motion a chain of events that would finally solve one of California's most frustrating cold cases. The man's name was Douglas Thomas, a retired truck driver, someone who had spent over 40 years behind the wheel of big rigs, hauling freight across America's highway system, from coast to coast, north to south, living a life of constant motion and transient connections. By 2022, Thomas was no longer actively driving, but his past was about to catch up with him in a dramatic way. Texas Rangers arrested Douglas Thomas in 2022 for a murder that had occurred 30 years earlier in Titus County, Texas. Think about that timing. 1992, 1 year before Sherri Herrera was killed in California. Titus County is in northeast Texas, about as far from the California desert as you can get while still being in the western United States. It's a different landscape, a different community, a different jurisdiction entirely. There was no obvious connection between the Titus County murder and what happened to Sherri on Interstate 10 in California. No reason for investigators in either state to think the cases might be related. But both cases had something in common: DNA evidence. The Titus County case, like Sherri's, had DNA collected from the crime scene. And like Sherri's case, that DNA had been preserved for decades, entered into databases, waiting for a match. When Texas Rangers identified Douglas Thomas as a suspect in the Titus County murder, they arrested him and collected his DNA. Standard procedure. When you're arrested for a serious crime in most states, your DNA goes into the system. A cheek swab, a few cells, and suddenly your genetic profile is searchable against every unsolved crime in the country. And that's exactly what happened. Thomas's DNA was collected, processed, and uploaded to CODIS. And the system, running its automatic comparisons, searching through thousands upon thousands of unsolved cases, found a hit. Not just one hit, multiple hits. Douglas Thomas's DNA matched the DNA from the Titus County murder scene. That was expected, it was why he'd been arrested in the first place. But it also matched DNA from another crime scene. A scene more than 1,000 miles away. A scene that Texas Rangers had never heard of, in a case that had nothing to do with their investigation. Sherri Herrera's case. The DNA from the Interstate 10 on-ramp in 1993. The biological evidence that had been preserved for 3 decades. The profile that had been sitting in CODIS, waiting patiently for a match. Suddenly, that match was here. Not a partial match. Not a familial connection. A direct match. The DNA from Sherri's body matched Douglas Thomas's profile. Imagine being the cold case investigator in Riverside County who got that notification. You're at your desk, maybe working on a different case, maybe doing paperwork, maybe thinking about lunch. Your computer pings. An email. A CODIS hit on one of your cold cases. You open it, expecting maybe a partial match that will need further investigation, or a false positive that you'll have to rule out. But instead, you see a direct match. High confidence. The DNA from your 30-year-old homicide matches a man who's just been arrested in Texas for another murder. Your heart rate increases. This is what every cold case investigator hopes for, the break that comes out of nowhere, the piece of information that transforms an unsolved case into something workable. You pull up the Sherri Herrera file, refreshing your memory on the details. Then you start digging into Douglas Thomas. Who is he? Where has he been? What's his history? And most importantly, what's his connection to Sherri Herrera? The Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team sprang into action. This was their moment. This was what all the years of preservation, all the periodic reviews, all the advances in forensic technology had been leading toward. They had a name. They had a suspect, and they had DNA evidence linking that suspect to their victim. After 30 years, they finally had somewhere to go with the investigation. The team started building their case. First, they verified the DNA match independently. CODIS hits are reliable, but you don't build a murder prosecution on a single computer match. You have independent labs retest the evidence. You make absolutely certain that the DNA from the crime scene and the DNA from Douglas Thomas are truly a match, that there's no possibility of error, contamination, or mislabeling. The tests came back positive. It was definitely him. Next, they researched Douglas Thomas's history. His employment record showed he'd been a long-haul truck driver for over 40 years. Over 40 years of crisscrossing the country, driving Interstate 10 and countless other highways, stopping at truck stops from California to Florida, from Texas to Michigan. They pulled his driving logs where available, trying to place him in the Desert Center area on or around March 30th, 1993. Driving logs from 30 years ago aren't always available, but the fact that Thomas had been working as a cross-country trucker made it entirely plausible that he'd been on Interstate 10 that day. The team also coordinated with Texas Rangers, sharing information about their case and learning more about the Titus County murder. What they discovered was chilling. The Titus County case bore similarities to Sherri's murder. Another victim, another violent death. Another case that had gone cold for decades because there was no suspect, only DNA evidence that went unmatched for 30 years. And now the same man was linked to both crimes. This raised an obvious question. Were there others? If Douglas Thomas killed someone in Texas in 1992 and someone in California in 1993, had he killed people in other states in other years during his 4 decades on the road? Were there other cold cases with DNA evidence that might match Thomas's profile? The investigators knew they were potentially looking at a serial killer, someone who had used the anonymity and mobility of the trucking profession to commit crimes across multiple jurisdictions, secure in the knowledge that different agencies rarely compared notes, and that without DNA matching technology, he'd never be connected to his victims. Law enforcement agencies across the country were notified. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, was consulted. This is a database of violent crimes, particularly homicides, where investigators can search for patterns and potential connections between cases. Agencies with unsolved homicides from the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, especially cases involving female victims near highway corridors, were urged to compare their DNA evidence against Thomas's profile. But the Riverside County team couldn't wait for those comparisons. They had their case to build. They had Sherri Herrera's family to inform. After 30 years, they finally had answers to deliver. They reached out to the family, setting up a meeting to discuss the break in the case. Imagine being Sherri's child, now an adult in your 30s or 40s, getting a call from a cold case detective saying they need to meet with you about your mother's murder. Your mother who was killed when you were a kid, whose case has been cold for your entire adult life. What do you feel? Hope? Fear? The reopening of old wounds? All of the above? When the investigators told the family about the DNA match, about Douglas Thomas's arrest in Texas, about the evidence connecting him to Sherri's murder, the reaction was likely a complex mix of emotions. Relief that someone had finally been identified. Anger that this person had been free for 30 years. Grief at being forced to confront the details of the crime all over again. And a desperate need for more information. Who was this man? Did he know Sherri? Why did he kill her? What happened that day? Some of those questions could be answered. Some couldn't. The investigators could tell the family about Thomas's background, his work as a truck driver, his arrest in Texas. They could explain the DNA evidence and how certain they were that Thomas was responsible. But they couldn't definitively say what happened on that on-ramp on March 30th, 1993. They couldn't say if Sherri knew Thomas, if she'd accepted a ride from him, if their encounter was random or planned. Unless Thomas confessed and provided details, some aspects of the crime would remain a mystery. The team in Riverside County now faced a logistical challenge. Douglas Thomas was in Texas, in custody for the Titus County murder. California wanted him for Sherri's murder. But Texas had arrested him first and was proceeding with their own prosecution. The two states had to coordinate. Texas would try Thomas first, and if he was convicted, California would seek extradition to try him for Sherri's murder. It wasn't ideal. The family in California had already waited 30 years, but it was the reality of jurisdictional issues when a suspect is connected to crimes in multiple states. In the meantime, the Riverside County team prepared their case. They compiled all the evidence, the DNA reports, Thomas's background information, everything they'd need for trial. They consulted with the district attorney's office about charges. Given the DNA evidence and the circumstances of the crime, they filed murder charges in case RIF 2202776, and they added a special circumstance allegation, murder during the commission of a rape. This is significant because special circumstance allegations can elevate a murder charge to capital murder in California, making the defendant eligible for life without the possibility of parole. The special circumstance allegation reflected what the evidence showed. Sherri hadn't just been killed. She'd been sexually assaulted and then killed. The DNA evidence proved that Thomas had been present, that he'd had sexual contact with Sherri around the time of her death. Combined with the circumstances of her death and the location of her body, the evidence painted a clear picture of a violent sexual assault that ended in murder. For the investigators who'd worked this case over the years, who'd periodically reviewed the file and wondered if it would ever be solved, this was vindication. For the family, it was the beginning of a new chapter. The waiting wasn't over. There would be extradition proceedings, court hearings, eventually a trial, but the nature of the waiting had changed. They weren't waiting for answers anymore. They were waiting for justice. And after 30 years, that distinction meant everything. The investigation into Douglas Thomas didn't end with the DNA match. If anything, that was just the beginning. Now that investigators had a suspect, they could build a comprehensive case, connecting dots that had been invisible for 3 decades. The Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team did what modern investigators do best. They conducted a deep dive into Thomas's life, particularly his movements and activities in 1993. This wasn't the kind of investigation that could have been done in real time back when the crime occurred. In 1993, without a specific suspect, there was no way to track who had been driving on Interstate 10 on March 30th. But now, with Thomas identified, investigators could work backwards, constructing a timeline of his life and seeing how it intersected with Sherri Herrera's death. Douglas Thomas had been a cross-country truck driver for over 40 years. Think about what that means in practical terms. Truck drivers log their routes, their hours, their stops. They have to, by law. The Department of Transportation requires detailed records of driving time to prevent fatigue-related accidents. In theory, Thomas's driving logs from March 1993 should show where he was, what route he was driving, where he stopped. In practice, driving logs from 30 years ago aren't always preserved. Trucking companies go out of business. Records get destroyed. Drivers switch companies. But investigators tried to track down whatever documentation existed. They also looked at Thomas's employment history. Which trucking companies had he worked for? What routes did he typically drive? Was he regularly on Interstate 10? Did his work take him through Southern California? Through the Desert Center area? Every piece of information helped build the picture of a man whose job put him in the right place at the right time to have killed Sherri Herrera. But the investigation went beyond just placing Thomas geographically. The detectives traveled to Texas to interview him. This is standard procedure when you have a suspect in custody for one crime and you're investigating them for another. You sit down, you read them their Miranda rights, and you ask questions. Sometimes suspects talk. Sometimes they lawyer up immediately and refuse to say a word. Either way, the attempt has to be made. We don't know the details of what Thomas said during those interviews, if he said anything at all. Those conversations are typically kept confidential until trial. But investigators would have approached the interview strategically. They might have started with general questions about his trucking career, his routes, his life in 1993. They might have shown him photos of Sherri, asking if he recognized her. They might have confronted him with the DNA evidence, explaining that his genetic material was found at the crime scene, asking him to explain how it got there. If Thomas denied involvement, the investigators would have pressed. The DNA doesn't lie. It's not ambiguous. It's not circumstantial. It's direct physical evidence placing him in contact with Sherri Herrera at the time of her death. So if he claims he wasn't there, if he claims he never met her, the evidence contradicts him. And juries understand DNA evidence. It's been part of the American legal landscape for decades now, featured in countless crime shows and real-life cases. When prosecutors present DNA evidence, it carries enormous weight. The investigators also looked for patterns in Thomas's life. The Titus County, Texas murder had occurred in 1992, just 1 year before Sherri's murder. Same general time frame, same type of victim, a woman. Same type of crime, a violent homicide with sexual assault overtones. Same profession for the killer, a truck driver with the mobility and anonymity to commit crimes across state lines. The parallels were impossible to ignore. This led to a broader question. Were there other victims? Serial offenders rarely commit just 2 crimes and then stop. If Thomas killed in Texas in 92 and California in 93, what about 94? 95? The years stretching all the way to when he retired? Over 40 years of driving trucks across America. Over 40 years of opportunity. Over 40 years of potential victims. The FBI got involved at this point, as they often do in cases involving multiple jurisdictions and potential serial offenders. The Bureau has resources that local agencies don't: massive databases, behavioral analysts, agents who specialize in cold cases and serial crime. They helped coordinate the sharing of information between states, making sure that every agency with a potentially related unsolved case knew about Douglas Thomas and could compare their evidence to his DNA profile. And agencies responded. Cold case units from across the country pulled files on unsolved homicides from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. They looked for cases that fit the pattern. Female victims, crimes occurring near major highways, evidence of sexual assault, cases that had DNA evidence but no match. Those cases were prioritized for comparison against Thomas's profile. This process takes time. DNA comparison isn't instantaneous, especially when you're dealing with older evidence that might be degraded or with labs that have backlogs of cases to process. But the work was being done, and the possibility loomed that Douglas Thomas might be connected to a string of murders across multiple states, a cross-country killing spree enabled by the anonymity of highway travel and the limitations of pre-DNA technology law enforcement. Back in Riverside County, the cold case team was building their prosecution case. They coordinated closely with the district attorney's office, making sure every piece of evidence was documented, every test was verified, every link in the chain of custody was solid. Murder cases hinge on the quality of the evidence and the thoroughness of the investigation. Defense attorneys will scrutinize every detail, looking for errors, contamination, anything that might cast doubt on their client's guilt. The prosecution's job is to anticipate those challenges and ensure the case is airtight. The DNA evidence was the cornerstone, but it wasn't the only element. Investigators compiled everything. The original crime scene photos and reports from 1993, witness statements, the autopsy report, the timeline of events, Thomas's background and employment history, the circumstances of his arrest in Texas and his conviction there. All of it together painted a picture of a man who had committed a brutal crime in 1993 and had escaped justice for 3 decades until modern forensic science caught up with him. The prosecution also had to consider the victim's family. Sherri's children had been waiting 30 years for this moment. They deserved to be kept informed, to understand the legal process, to know what to expect as the case moved forward. Victim advocates worked with the family, explaining each step, preparing them for the likelihood that they'd have to wait longer while Thomas was tried in Texas first, reassuring them that California hadn't forgotten about Sherri and wouldn't let this case slip away. In Texas, Douglas Thomas was facing his own reckoning. The Titus County murder trial proceeded, and the evidence there was similarly damning. DNA connected him to that crime scene just as surely as it connected him to Sherri's. When that trial concluded, when the verdict came back and Thomas was convicted, it added another layer to the California case. Now he wasn't just a suspect. He was a convicted murderer, someone who'd already been found guilty of killing once. The pattern was established. The evidence was there, and California was next in line. The extradition process began. This is a formal legal procedure where one state requests that another state transfer custody of a prisoner so they can face charges. It's usually straightforward when there's a conviction in the first state. California files the paperwork, Texas reviews it, and assuming everything is in order, the transfer is approved. But it takes time. Legal processes always take time. Forms have to be filed. Hearings have to be scheduled. Judges have to sign orders. And through it all, Sherri's family had to wait, knowing that justice was coming but not knowing exactly when. For the investigators, this period was a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. Satisfaction that they'd solved a case that had been cold for 3 decades, that they'd identified the killer and built a strong case against him. Anticipation because the work wasn't done yet. There was still a trial to get through, still a conviction to secure, still a sentence to be handed down. And beyond that, there were potentially other cases to investigate, other victims to identify, other families who might finally get answers if Thomas could be connected to additional murders. The modern investigation of a 30-year-old crime is a strange thing. You're using cutting-edge technology and contemporary investigative techniques to solve something that happened in a completely different era. You're interviewing people whose memories of events from 3 decades ago are faded and unreliable. You're working with evidence that's been stored longer than some of your fellow officers have been alive. But you're also benefiting from advances that make today's impossible yesterday's routine. DNA databases that contain millions of profiles. Computer systems that can search through vast amounts of data in seconds. Forensic techniques that can extract information from microscopic samples. All of these tools, all of this technology, all of this investigative sophistication came together to solve Sherri Herrera's murder. But none of it would have mattered if the original investigators in 1993 hadn't done their jobs correctly. If they hadn't collected the DNA evidence. If they hadn't preserved it properly. If they hadn't documented the crime scene thoroughly. The modern investigators were standing on the shoulders of their predecessors, using the foundation that had been laid 3 decades earlier to finally deliver justice. And that's one of the most important lessons from cases like this. Cold cases are solved through a combination of past and present. The past provides the evidence, the documentation, the foundation. The present provides the technology, the databases, the analytical tools. Together, they create opportunities for justice that didn't exist when the crime was first committed. All it takes is patience, persistence, and a refusal to let victims be forgotten. Let's talk about the evidence that breaks a case wide open. The piece of information so compelling, so irrefutable, that it transforms everything from theory to fact, from suspicion to certainty. In Sherri Herrera's case, that smoking gun was DNA. But let's dig deeper into what that actually means, because DNA evidence isn't magic. It's science, and understanding how it works helps us appreciate just how powerful it is. When investigators collected biological evidence from Sherri Herrera's body in 1993, they were collecting cells. Human cells contain DNA, the genetic code that makes each person unique. With the exception of identical twins, no 2 people have the same DNA profile. When forensic scientists analyze DNA from a crime scene, they're looking at specific markers, locations in the genome that vary between individuals. They create a profile based on these markers, essentially a genetic fingerprint that identifies the person who left that biological material. The DNA collected from Sherri's case was analyzed and a profile was created. This profile represented the person who had been in physical contact with Sherri at or around the time of her death. Given the nature of the crime, a homicide with evidence of sexual assault, the DNA profile was almost certainly that of her killer. There was no innocent explanation for this person's DNA to be present. They weren't a friend who'd given her a hug earlier that day. They weren't a family member. They were the perpetrator. But a DNA profile without a match is like having a perfect photograph of a suspect without knowing their name. You know what you're looking for, but you don't know where to find it. That was the situation from 1993 until 2022. The profile existed. It was entered into databases as they came online. But there was no match. Douglas Thomas's DNA wasn't in the system because he'd never been arrested, or because he'd been arrested before DNA collection became standard, or because the jurisdiction that arrested him didn't participate in CODIS. The reasons don't really matter. The result was the same. No match, no suspect, no justice. Then came Thomas's arrest in Texas for the Titus County murder. His DNA was collected and uploaded to CODIS as part of standard booking procedure for serious crimes. And the system, running its automatic comparisons, found what it had been looking for. Thomas's DNA profile matched the DNA profile from Sherri Herrera's crime scene. Not a partial match. Not a familial connection that would require further investigation. A direct match. The probability that the DNA from Sherri's case came from someone other than Douglas Thomas was astronomically small. We're talking about odds of 1 in trillions or more. This is the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream about. It's objective. It's scientific. It's not dependent on witness memory or testimony that might change or be challenged. DNA doesn't forget. DNA doesn't lie. DNA doesn't have a motive to mislead. It is what it is. And in this case, it was Douglas Thomas's genetic material found on Sherri Herrera's body at the time of her murder. When the Riverside County investigators received notification of the DNA match, they would have immediately begun the verification process. They would have had independent labs retest both samples, the preserved evidence from 1993 and the reference sample taken from Thomas in 2022. They would have made sure that the chain of custody for the evidence was intact, that there was no possibility of contamination or mix-up. They would have done everything possible to ensure that the match was genuine and would hold up under scrutiny in court. The tests confirmed it. Douglas Thomas's DNA was present on Sherri Herrera's body. The scientific evidence was conclusive, but investigators wanted more than just the DNA. They wanted to understand the complete picture of what happened that day. They wanted to know if Thomas would admit to the crime, or if he'd deny it and force the case to trial. They wanted to see if he'd provide any information about what happened, why he targeted Sherri, whether there was any connection between them or if this was a random act of violence. So investigators traveled to Texas to interview Thomas. He was already in custody for the Titus County murder, so access wasn't an issue. The interview would have been conducted in a controlled setting, a jail interview room most likely, with Thomas in custody and investigators from California present along with their Texas counterparts. The interview would have been recorded, both audio and video, to preserve a record of everything that was said. We don't have access to the details of that interview, but we can infer certain things. Thomas would have been read his Miranda rights, informing him of his right to remain silent and to have an attorney present. He could have invoked those rights immediately, refusing to speak without a lawyer. Many suspects do exactly that, especially when they're already facing serious charges and they know that anything they say could be used against them. But sometimes suspects talk. Sometimes they think they can talk their way out of trouble. Sometimes they want to tell their side of the story. Sometimes they're caught so completely that they decide there's no point in denying it. Sometimes they even feel remorse and want to confess. We don't know which category Douglas Thomas fell into, but the investigators would have tried to get him talking. They might have started with general questions. Your background, your work history, your routes as a truck driver. Do you remember 1993? Were you driving in California that year? Did you ever drive Interstate 10 through the Desert Center area? These questions seem innocuous, but they're laying groundwork, getting Thomas to confirm facts that investigators already know or can verify, establishing a baseline before moving to the specific crime. Then they would have gotten more direct. Do you recognize this woman? They'd show him photos of Sherri Herrera, probably from before her death, when she was alive and smiling, a real person with a real life. Do you remember ever meeting her? Ever seeing her? Ever giving her a ride? The questions are designed to see if Thomas will admit to any connection to Sherri, anything that might explain the DNA evidence. And then comes the hammer. We have DNA evidence from Sherri Herrera's body. That DNA is yours. It's a match. There's no doubt. The odds of it being someone else are essentially zero. So we know you were there. We know you had contact with her. What we don't know is why. What we don't know is exactly what happened. So why don't you tell us your side of the story? This is the moment where a suspect has to make a choice. Deny everything and claim the evidence is wrong, which is a hard sell when the DNA match is solid. Admit to being present but claim the encounter was consensual or the death was accidental, which is difficult when the victim was found on a highway on-ramp with evidence of violent assault. Or confess to the crime, either because you're caught and you know it, or because you want to unburden yourself, or because you hope that cooperation might lead to some kind of leniency. We don't know what Douglas Thomas said in that interview room. What we do know is that the investigators came away with information that bolstered their case. They came away confident that they could not only charge Thomas with Sherri's murder, but also secure a conviction. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA was irrefutable. And whatever Thomas said, or didn't say, in that interview room didn't change the fundamental fact. His DNA was at the crime scene, and there was no innocent explanation for its presence. The investigators also looked at the broader pattern. 2 murders 1 year apart in different states. Both involved female victims. Both had been cold cases for 3 decades. Both were solved through DNA evidence when Thomas was arrested in Texas. The similarities suggested a pattern of behavior. Predatory behavior. The kind of thing that serial offenders do. And if there were 2 known victims, logic suggested there might be more. This wasn't just about solving Sherri Herrera's case anymore, as important as that was. This was about determining the full scope of Douglas Thomas's crimes. How many women had he attacked? How many had he killed? Were there bodies that had never been found? Victims whose families had been wondering for decades what happened to their missing daughters? Mothers? Sisters? These were questions that investigators across the country were now asking, and they were comparing their unsolved cases against Thomas's DNA profile, hoping for matches, hoping for answers, hoping to finally close cases that had haunted them for years. For Sherri's family, the DNA evidence was vindication. It proved that the person responsible had been identified. It proved that the case hadn't been forgotten. It proved that justice, though delayed, was still possible. The smoking gun wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was proof that truth can eventually emerge, that science can succeed where eyewitness and circumstantial evidence fails, that even 3 decades later, the guilty can be held accountable. But evidence alone doesn't deliver justice. Evidence has to be presented in court. It has to survive challenges from the defense. It has to be explained to a jury in a way they can understand and trust. The smoking gun doesn't fire itself. Prosecutors have to pull the trigger. And that meant the next phase of the process. Taking Douglas Thomas to trial and making sure that the evidence, as powerful as it was, translated into a conviction that would hold up on appeal and result in a sentence that reflected the severity of the crime. The smoking gun was loaded. Now it was time to use it. The arrest of Douglas Thomas for Sherri Herrera's murder didn't happen the way arrests often do on television, with detectives bursting through a door, weapons drawn, taking a suspect by surprise. Thomas was already in custody in Texas, already convicted of 1 murder, already serving a sentence that would keep him in prison for decades. But California wanted him too. California had its own case, its own victim, its own demand for justice. The formal process began with the filing of charges. Riverside County prosecutors, working with the cold case investigative team, prepared murder charges in case number RIF 2202776. The charge was clear murder. But the prosecutors went further, adding a special circumstance allegation that elevated the severity of the charge and carried the potential for a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. That special circumstance was murder during the commission of a rape. Special circumstances in California murder cases are serious business. They're reserved for murders that are particularly heinous, that involve additional criminal acts, that demonstrate a level of depravity beyond simply killing someone. Murder during a rape qualifies because it shows that the victim was not only killed but was also sexually assaulted, that they suffered multiple violations before their death. It's an aggravating factor that juries and judges consider when determining punishment. The charges were filed, and the legal machinery began to turn. Extradition paperwork was prepared. California formally requested that Texas transfer custody of Douglas Thomas so he could face trial in Riverside County. Texas reviewed the request, confirmed that the charges were valid and that the evidence supported extradition, and approved the transfer. This process takes time, weeks or even months, but it's relatively straightforward when the suspect is already convicted and incarcerated. It's not like he's going to flee or disappear. He's in prison and he's going to stay in prison whether in Texas or California. On August 25th, the transfer happened. Douglas Thomas was transported from a Texas prison to Riverside County, California. He was booked into the county jail, processed, fingerprinted, photographed. His mugshot would have been taken, capturing the face of a man who had evaded justice for 30 years but was now facing the consequences of his actions. That mugshot would eventually be released to the media, and when it was, the community reaction was swift and intense. For people in Tulare, where Sherri had lived, and in Riverside County, where her body had been found, the arrest brought a flood of emotions. Relief that someone had finally been caught, anger that it took 30 years, curiosity about who this man was and how he'd remained undetected for so long, and sadness, because even with an arrest, Sherri Herrera was still dead. Her children had still grown up without their mother, and 30 years of pain couldn't be undone. The media coverage was extensive. Cold cases that are solved after decades make for compelling news stories. They have all the elements that journalists and audiences love. A victim who deserves justice. A family that has waited years for answers. A dedicated team of investigators who never gave up, and modern forensic science that makes the impossible possible. Sherri's case had all of that, plus the added angle of a truck driver who potentially committed crimes across multiple states, raising the specter of a serial killer who had hidden in plain sight for decades. News outlets ran stories with headlines like, "Decades-old cold case solved through DNA," and "Truck driver arrested for 30-year-old murder." They published Sherri's photo, reminding people that behind the case file and the legal proceedings was a real person. A mother of 4, someone who mattered. They interviewed cold case experts about how DNA technology has revolutionized the solving of old cases. They talked to former investigators who had worked the case in the 90s and were gratified to see it finally solved. The community response on social media was equally intense. People expressed support for Sherri's family. They praised the investigators for their persistence. They speculated about whether Thomas might be connected to other unsolved cases. And they debated the death penalty, with some arguing that someone who commits such brutal crimes deserves the ultimate punishment, and others pointing out that the special circumstance allegation carried the possibility of life without parole, which would ensure Thomas died in prison without the lengthy and expensive appeals process that accompanies death penalty cases. For Sherri's family, the arrest and the media attention were bittersweet. On one hand, they wanted the story told. They wanted people to know about Sherri, to remember her, to understand what had been taken from them. They wanted the person responsible to be publicly identified and held accountable. But on the other hand, it meant reliving the worst moments of their lives in public. It meant seeing crime scene details discussed in news articles. It meant reading comments from strangers who had opinions about their loss. It meant being thrust into the spotlight at a time when they were grappling with complex emotions. Victim advocates worked with the family during this period, helping them navigate the media attention, preparing them for the court proceedings that would follow, and ensuring their voices would be heard. In many jurisdictions, victims' families have the right to provide victim impact statements at sentencing, and advocates help families prepare those statements so they can express how the crime has affected them. On September 10th, Douglas Thomas made his first court appearance in California. He was brought before a judge for arraignment, the formal process where charges are read and the defendant enters a plea. Thomas, likely on the advice of his attorney, pleaded not guilty to the murder charge and the special circumstance allegation. This is standard. Even when the evidence is overwhelming, defendants often plead not guilty initially, preserving their options for potential plea deals or trial strategies. The judge scheduled a preliminary hearing for December, a few months away. Preliminary hearings are where the prosecution presents enough evidence to show that there's probable cause to believe the defendant committed the crime. It's a lower standard than the beyond a reasonable doubt standard required for conviction at trial, but it's an important step in the process. If the judge finds probable cause, the case proceeds to trial. If not, the charges can be dismissed, though that's rare when the evidence is as strong as it was in this case. Thomas was held without bail, as is typical in murder cases, especially those involving special circumstances. He was housed in the Riverside County Jail, awaiting his next court date, his freedom permanently behind him whether he was eventually convicted of Sherri's murder or not, because he was already serving a lengthy sentence for the Texas conviction. For the prosecution team, the period between arraignment and preliminary hearing was spent preparing. They organized their evidence, prepared witnesses, coordinated with forensic experts who would testify about the DNA analysis, and built the narrative they would present to the court and eventually to a jury. They knew the defense would challenge everything. That's their job, so every element of the case had to be airtight. The defense, meanwhile, was evaluating their options. With DNA evidence this strong, an outright acquittal was unlikely. But there are other strategies. Challenge the collection and handling of the evidence. Argue that the DNA evidence doesn't prove murder, only that Thomas had contact with Sherri at some point. Negotiate a plea deal that might result in a lesser sentence. Present mitigating factors that might influence sentencing. Defense attorneys work within the constraints of the evidence, and when the evidence is damning, their job becomes damage control rather than seeking innocence. The arrest shocked the community, but as the initial wave of media coverage subsided and the case moved into the slower rhythm of the court system, attention began to shift to the broader implications. How many other cases might Thomas be connected to? Were there other families out there who didn't even know that the person responsible for their loved one's death had been arrested? These questions lingered, and investigators across the country were working to find answers, comparing their cold cases to Thomas's DNA profile, hoping to finally close cases that had gone unsolved for decades. Justice for Sherri Herrera was in motion. The arrest had happened. The charges had been filed. The legal process was underway. But as anyone familiar with the criminal justice system knows, the process is long, and there would be many more steps before a final verdict and sentence. The arrest was a victory, but the war wasn't over yet. The American criminal justice system is deliberate. It moves slowly by design, ensuring that defendants have time to prepare a defense, that evidence is thoroughly examined, that constitutional rights are protected. For families of victims, this deliberate pace can be excruciating. They've already waited years. In Sherri Herrera's case, 3 decades, and now they have to wait longer for trials, hearings, and legal proceedings that seem designed to delay the justice they're seeking. Douglas Thomas's case was no exception. After his September arraignment where he pleaded not guilty, the court scheduled a preliminary hearing for December. This hearing is a crucial step in the California criminal justice process. The prosecution must present enough evidence to convince a judge that there's probable cause to believe the defendant committed the crime. It's not a full trial, there's no jury, and the standard of proof is lower, but it's the prosecution's opportunity to lay out the core of their case. In preparation for the preliminary hearing, the prosecution team in Riverside County assembled their evidence. The centerpiece, of course, was the DNA analysis. Forensic experts who had tested the evidence from 1993 and compared it to Douglas Thomas's DNA profile would testify about their findings. They'd explain the science behind DNA matching, the statistical probability that the match could be coincidental, and their conclusion that the DNA from Sherri Herrera's body came from Thomas. DNA testimony can be technical and complex, involving discussions of alleles, loci, and probability statistics. Prosecutors have to present this information in a way that judges and eventually jurors can understand. They use visual aids, analogies, and clear explanations to make the science accessible. The key points they need to establish are: DNA is unique to each individual. The testing process is reliable and scientifically accepted. The chain of custody for the evidence was maintained properly, and the match between the crime scene DNA and Thomas's DNA is conclusive. The prosecution would also present testimony about the original investigation in 1993. Investigators who worked the case, if they were still alive and available, might testify about the crime scene, the collection of evidence, and the initial attempts to identify a suspect. This testimony establishes the foundation of the case, showing that the investigation was thorough and that the evidence was handled properly from the very beginning. Crime scene photographs and reports from 1993 would be entered into evidence. These documents, preserved for 3 decades, provide a contemporaneous record of what investigators found on that Interstate 10 on-ramp. They show the condition of Sherri's body, the location where she was found, the evidence that was collected. They're difficult to look at. Crime scene photos always are, but they're necessary to establish the nature of the crime. The medical examiner's report would also be crucial. The autopsy conducted in 1993 determined Sherri's cause of death and documented the injuries she sustained. This report supports the special circumstance allegation of murder during the commission of a rape, showing that Sherri was not only killed but also sexually assaulted. The medical evidence, combined with the DNA evidence, paints a clear picture of what happened to Sherri. The defense, during the preliminary hearing, would have the opportunity to cross-examine witnesses and challenge the evidence. But their options are limited when the DNA match is this strong. They might question the collection and preservation of the evidence, looking for any break in the chain of custody that could suggest contamination or mishandling. They might challenge the statistical probability calculations, trying to suggest that the match isn't as certain as the prosecution claims. They might argue that while Thomas's DNA was present, that doesn't necessarily prove he committed murder. Maybe the contact was consensual, maybe someone else killed Sherri after Thomas had contact with her. But these arguments are difficult to sustain when the totality of the evidence is considered. Sherri's body was found on a desolate highway on-ramp. She had been sexually assaulted and killed. Thomas's DNA was present. The circumstances don't support an innocent explanation. The defense would know this, and their strategy at the preliminary hearing might simply be to preserve their objections for trial, to see what evidence the prosecution has, and to start building arguments for later stages of the case. At the conclusion of the preliminary hearing, assuming the judge found probable cause, which was virtually certain given the strength of the evidence, the case would be bound over for trial. This means the case would proceed to the next phase, where Thomas would face a jury of his peers and the prosecution would have to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Trial preparation is an intensive process. Both sides depose witnesses, review evidence, develop their strategies. The prosecution has to decide which witnesses to call, in what order, and how to structure their presentation to build a compelling narrative. They have to anticipate the defense's arguments and prepare rebuttals. They have to work with jury consultants to understand what potential jurors might find persuasive or problematic. They have to prepare for the emotional testimony that will come from Sherri's family members. The defense has an equally complex task. They have to challenge the prosecution's evidence while being mindful that over-aggressive tactics can backfire, making the defendant seem guilty and unsympathetic. They have to decide whether Thomas will testify in his own defense, a risky proposition, because it subjects him to cross-examination and allows the prosecution to probe his story for inconsistencies. They have to look for any mitigating factors that might influence sentencing if Thomas is convicted. And they have to consider whether a plea deal might be preferable to the risk of trial, especially if the Texas conviction is any indication of how juries respond to DNA evidence in murder cases. Plea negotiations often happen behind the scenes in criminal cases. The prosecution might offer to drop the special circumstance allegation in exchange for a guilty plea, which would make Thomas eligible for parole after a certain number of years rather than facing life without parole. Or they might agree to a specific sentencing recommendation if Thomas pleads guilty, providing some certainty rather than risking a harsher sentence after a trial. The defense might counter with different terms, trying to negotiate the best possible outcome for their client. We don't know if plea negotiations occurred in this case or what their outcome was. What we know is that, as of the latest reports, the case was proceeding through the court system, with Thomas having pleaded not guilty and hearings scheduled to move the case toward trial. The legal process was unfolding, slowly but inexorably, toward a resolution. For Sherri's family, each court appearance was another step on a long journey. They might have attended the hearings, sitting in the courtroom gallery, seeing Douglas Thomas in person for the first time, this man who had taken their mother from them 30 years ago. They might have been frustrated by the legal delays and technical arguments that seemed to have nothing to do with the fundamental question. Did this man kill Sherri Herrera? But they also understood that the process, as frustrating as it was, existed to ensure that justice was done correctly, that Thomas's rights were protected so that any conviction would be unassailable on appeal. The prosecution kept the family informed throughout the process. They explained each step, what to expect, what the likely outcomes were. They prepared the family for the possibility of a trial, which would mean testifying, facing cross-examination, hearing difficult details about Sherri's death. They also prepared them for the possibility of a plea deal, which would mean no trial, but also no opportunity to present victim impact statements to a jury. The courtroom phase of the case was where the abstract concept of justice became concrete. Evidence that had been collected 3 decades earlier would be presented to a judge and potentially a jury. Witnesses would testify under oath. Legal arguments would be made and ruled on. And at the end of it all, there would be a verdict. Guilty or not guilty. Given the strength of the DNA evidence, the outcome seemed clear, but in the legal system, nothing is guaranteed until the verdict is read and the sentence is pronounced. The trial would also be an opportunity to tell Sherri's story in a public forum, to remind people that she wasn't just a case number or a victim in a crime statistic, but a real person with a real life, a mother who was loved and missed, someone whose death left a permanent scar on her family and community. The trial would be about holding Douglas Thomas accountable, but it would also be about honoring Sherri's memory and ensuring that her name was remembered for who she was, not just for how she died. As the case moved through the court system, investigators continued their work. They continued to compare Thomas's DNA to other cold cases. They continued to build timelines of his trucking routes, trying to place him in locations where unsolved murders had occurred. They continued to interview people who knew him, looking for any information that might shed light on his other potential crimes. The courtroom proceedings were crucial for delivering justice in Sherri's case, but they were just one part of a larger investigation into a man who might have committed multiple murders over 4 decades. Justice for Sherri Herrera was within reach. The evidence was strong. The case was solid. The legal process was moving forward. And while the wheels of justice turned slowly, they were turning in the right direction, toward a verdict that would finally hold Douglas Thomas accountable for what he did on that desolate highway on-ramp in March of 1993. As of the most recent reports, Douglas Thomas's trial in California for the murder of Sherri Herrera is still pending. He has pleaded not guilty, and the case is working its way through the court system, with hearings scheduled and legal proceedings ongoing. But even though a final verdict in California hasn't been reached yet, there's already been a significant measure of justice served. Thomas's conviction in Texas for the Titus County murder. In Texas, Douglas Thomas stood trial for a murder he committed in 1992, 1 year before Sherri Herrera was killed. The evidence in that case was similarly compelling. DNA evidence connected him to the crime scene, just as it did in Sherri's case. The Texas trial proceeded, the evidence was presented, and the jury rendered a verdict. Guilty. Douglas Thomas was convicted of murder and sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. 40 years to life. That's a sentence that ensures Thomas will never walk free again. Even if he somehow becomes eligible for parole at the earliest possible point, he would be well into his 80s or 90s, far beyond the point where he could pose a threat to anyone. More likely, he'll die in prison, which is exactly what families of his victims believe should happen. The Texas conviction was significant for Sherri's case in California. It established a pattern. It showed that Thomas wasn't just a suspect in one case, but a convicted murderer whose crimes spanned multiple states and years. It gave California prosecutors additional ammunition for their case, demonstrating to a jury that Thomas had the capacity and willingness to commit this type of crime. In California, when Thomas's case does go to trial, the prosecution will present their evidence methodically. They'll start with establishing who Sherri was, humanizing her for the jury so they understand that this case is about a real person, not just a forensic exercise. They'll walk through the events of March 30th, 1993, establishing what happened that day to the best of their knowledge. They'll present the crime scene evidence, the medical examiner's findings, and the DNA analysis that connects Thomas to the crime. The DNA evidence will be the centerpiece of the trial. Forensic experts will take the stand and explain, in clear terms, how DNA analysis works. They'll testify about the samples collected from Sherri's body in 1993, how those samples were preserved, how they were tested, and what the results showed. They'll explain that the DNA profile from the crime scene matches Douglas Thomas's profile, and they'll provide statistical analysis showing that the probability of this being a coincidental match is infinitesimally small, 1 in trillions or even quadrillions. The defense will have their opportunity to cross-examine these experts, to challenge the methodology, to raise doubts if they can. But DNA evidence is well established in American courts. The science is accepted. The techniques are reliable. Juries understand that DNA doesn't lie. Short of showing contamination or mishandling of evidence, which would require finding specific errors in the chain of custody, the defense will struggle to effectively challenge DNA testimony. The prosecution will also present testimony from investigators who worked the case, both the original detectives from 1993 and the cold case team that solved it in 2022. They'll explain how the case went cold, how the DNA evidence was preserved, and how the break finally came when Thomas was arrested in Texas. This testimony provides context and shows the jury that investigators never gave up, that they were persistent in seeking justice for Sherri. When it comes time for victim impact statements, Sherri's children will have their opportunity to address the court. They'll talk about what it was like growing up without their mother. They'll describe the milestones she missed, graduations, weddings, the births of her grandchildren. They'll explain how the uncertainty of the unsolved case compounded their grief, how not knowing who killed their mother or why added an extra layer of pain to their loss. And they'll express their feelings about Douglas Thomas, the man who took their mother from them and then lived free for 30 years while they suffered. These statements are often the most emotional part of a trial. They're not about establishing guilt. That's the jury's job based on the evidence. They're about showing the human impact of the crime, about giving the victims' families a voice, about ensuring that the defendant and the court understand the full scope of the harm that was caused. Judges consider these statements when determining sentences, and even though the sentence in a special circumstance murder case is largely prescribed by law, life without parole, the impact statements serve an important function in acknowledging the victims and their families. The jury, after hearing all the evidence, will deliberate. They'll review the DNA evidence, the testimony, the crime scene photos and reports. They'll discuss the case among themselves, working to reach a unanimous verdict as required in criminal cases. And given the strength of the evidence, the verdict seems all but certain: guilty of murder with the special circumstance allegation affirmed. When that verdict is read, when the forewoman stands and announces that the jury has found Douglas Thomas guilty, there will be a collective release of tension in the courtroom. Sherri's family will likely cry, tears of relief, sadness, and maybe even a bit of satisfaction that justice has finally been served. The prosecutors will feel vindicated, knowing that their work, and the work of generations of investigators before them, has resulted in a conviction. And Douglas Thomas will face the reality that he will spend the rest of his life in prison, that he will die behind bars, that he will never again know freedom. The sentencing phase, which may be immediate or scheduled for a later date, will be when the judge formally imposes the sentence. Given the special circumstance finding, the sentence will be life in prison without the possibility of parole. This is one of the harshest sentences available in California's criminal justice system, reserved for the most serious murders. It means Thomas will never be eligible for parole hearings. He will never have the opportunity to argue that he's been rehabilitated and should be released. He will remain in prison until he dies, whether that's in 5 years or 25 years or longer. For Sherri's family, the conviction and sentence represent closure, though not in the sense of moving on or forgetting. You don't move on from losing a loved one to murder. You don't forget. But closure means having answers. It means knowing who is responsible and seeing them held accountable. It means that the person who destroyed your family faces consequences, that they don't get to live free while you suffer. It means that the legal system, for all its frustrations and delays, eventually delivered justice. The conviction will also provide a sense of validation for the investigators who worked the case over the years. For the detectives who responded to the scene in 1993 and did everything right, collecting evidence, preserving it, documenting the scene, their diligence paid off 3 decades later. For the cold case investigators who never gave up, who periodically reviewed the file, who were ready when the DNA match came through, their persistence resulted in justice. And for the forensic scientists who developed and refined DNA analysis techniques, who built the databases and automated comparison systems, their work proved its value yet again. Justice served doesn't bring Sherri Herrera back. It doesn't erase 30 years of pain for her family. It doesn't undo the childhood her children experienced without their mother. But it does provide accountability. It does affirm that society values her life, that her death mattered, that the person responsible doesn't get to escape consequences. And in a world where so many crimes go unsolved, where so many cold cases remain cold, where so many families never get answers, that matters more than words can express, Sherri Herrera's case is about more than just one murder solved after 3 decades. It's about the evolution of criminal justice, the power of forensic science, the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up, and the families who carry the burden of loss while waiting for answers that may never come, until suddenly, they do. Let's talk about what this case represents and why it matters beyond the specific facts of what happened on Interstate 10 in 1993. First, it's a testament to the importance of evidence preservation. In 1993, DNA analysis was in its infancy. It was expensive, time-consuming, and not yet the standard tool it would become. But the investigators who worked Sherri's case recognized its potential. They collected biological evidence carefully. They preserved it properly. They maintained chain of custody. They did everything by the book, even though the technology to fully utilize that evidence didn't exist yet. They were essentially investing in the future, trusting that someday, somehow, the evidence they were preserving would become useful. That decision, to collect and preserve DNA evidence even when it couldn't immediately solve the case, is what made justice possible 30 years later. If those investigators had cut corners, if they'd failed to properly preserve the samples, if they'd stored them incorrectly and allowed degradation, the match to Douglas Thomas would never have happened. The case would still be cold. Sherri's family would still be waiting for answers. Thomas would likely never face justice for what he did. This is a lesson for law enforcement agencies everywhere. Preserve the evidence. Even if you can't solve the case today, even if the technology doesn't exist yet, even if it seems hopeless, preserve the evidence. Because technology advances, databases grow, techniques improve. What's impossible today becomes routine tomorrow. And the only way to take advantage of those future capabilities is to make sure the evidence exists and is usable when the time comes. Second, Sherri's case demonstrates the power of DNA databases, particularly CODIS. The Combined DNA Index System was launched by the FBI in the late 1990s, initially with profiles from a handful of states. Over the years, it has grown to include millions of profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scenes across all 50 states. It's one of the most powerful law enforcement tools ever developed, enabling connections between crimes that would have been impossible to make through traditional investigation. Douglas Thomas's arrest in Texas for the Titus County murder put his DNA into CODIS. That entry automatically triggered comparisons against every unsolved case in the system. Without human intervention, without anyone specifically looking for connections, the system identified the match to Sherri's case. This is the power of automated searching at scale. It finds patterns and connections that human investigators would never see because they're working across jurisdictional boundaries, across decades, across thousands of cases. The expansion of DNA databases and the increasing use of genetic genealogy have led to a wave of cold case solutions in recent years. The Golden State Killer case in California, solved in 2018 through genetic genealogy, opened the floodgates. Investigators realized they didn't have to wait for a direct CODIS match. They could upload crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, find relatives of the suspect, and use traditional genealogy research to identify the person responsible. This technique has solved dozens of cold cases and counting. Sherri's case was solved through a direct CODIS match, but the principle is the same. DNA evidence, combined with comprehensive databases and sophisticated searching techniques, can solve cases that were once considered unsolvable. It gives hope to families of cold case victims that answers might still come, even decades after the crime. Third, this case highlights the reality of serial offenders and the challenges of tracking them across jurisdictions. Douglas Thomas drove trucks across America for over 40 years. He had the mobility to commit crimes in Texas, California, and potentially many other states. He had the anonymity of a transient profession where he could be in a different city every day, where no one tracked his movements, where he wasn't tied to any specific community. For a predator, these conditions are ideal. Law enforcement has struggled for decades with the problem of criminals who cross jurisdictional boundaries. A murder in Texas is investigated by Texas Rangers and local police. A murder in California is investigated by California agencies. Unless someone specifically looks for connections between the cases, unless there are obvious similarities that lead investigators to reach out to each other, the crimes are treated as separate incidents. This is how serial offenders often operate for years or even decades before being caught. They spread their crimes across geography and time, making patterns difficult to detect. DNA databases help solve this problem by creating a national system where evidence from all jurisdictions can be compared. But there are still gaps. Not all crimes result in DNA evidence. Not all DNA evidence is collected or preserved properly. Not all jurisdictions have fully uploaded their profiles to CODIS. And there are still offenders who, like Thomas prior to his Texas arrest, have never had their DNA collected for any reason. The system is powerful, but it's not perfect. Investigators are now reviewing cold cases from across the country, looking for potential connections to Douglas Thomas. His truck driving routes, his employment history, his presence in various locations over 4 decades. All of it is being mapped against unsolved homicides. If there are other victims, and sadly there probably are, DNA evidence might be able to connect them to Thomas. Those families might finally get the answers they've been waiting for, just as Sherri's family did. Fourth, this case demonstrates the value of cold case units and the specialized investigators who staff them. Solving a 30-year-old case requires different skills than investigating a fresh crime. You're working with decades-old evidence, faded memories, retired or deceased original investigators, and technology that has advanced far beyond what was available when the crime occurred. Cold case investigators need patience, thoroughness, and the ability to think creatively about how to approach cases that stumped everyone who looked at them before. The Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team exemplifies this specialized approach. They didn't give up on Sherri's case just because it had been cold for decades. They maintained the case file. They were ready when the DNA match came through. They traveled to Texas to interview Thomas. They built a solid prosecution case. They worked with Sherri's family to keep them informed and involved. They did everything right, and the result is justice for a victim who might otherwise have been forgotten. Many law enforcement agencies have created similar cold case units in recent years, recognizing that unsolved cases deserve continued attention and that new technologies might make them solvable. These units are solving cases at a remarkable rate, bringing closure to families who had given up hope and holding offenders accountable for crimes they thought they'd escaped. Finally, Sherri's case is a reminder of the human cost of violent crime. Behind every case file, every piece of DNA evidence, every court proceeding, there's a real person whose life was stolen from them. Sherri Herrera was 30 years old. She was a mother of 4 children. She had dreams, plans, people who loved her. Her murder didn't just end her life. It damaged everyone who knew her, especially her children, who grew up with a permanent hole in their lives. When we talk about cold cases being solved, it's easy to focus on the investigative techniques, the forensic science, the legal proceedings. Those things are important, but they're not the point. The point is that Sherri mattered. Her life mattered. Her death mattered. And justice for her matters, not as an abstract principle, but as recognition that society values her life and won't allow her murder to be forgotten or ignored. The conviction of Douglas Thomas, when it comes, will be a victory for Sherri's family. But it will also be a victory for every family of every cold case victim, because it proves that time doesn't grant immunity, that justice can still be served even decades later, that investigators and prosecutors won't give up, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, can eventually be brought to light. Sherri Herrera's name is no longer just associated with an unsolved murder from 1993. It's now associated with justice, with perseverance, with the power of forensic science and dedicated investigators. Her case will be studied in criminal justice classes. It will be cited in arguments for funding cold case units and expanding DNA databases. It will give hope to other families waiting for answers. And most importantly, it will ensure that Sherri is remembered not just as a victim, but as a person whose life mattered and whose death was not in vain. We're coming to the end of this story, but before we finish, I want to make sure we remember what this case is really about. It's not about DNA science, though that science made justice possible. It's not about cold case investigative techniques, though those techniques were crucial. It's not even about Douglas Thomas, though his crimes and his capture are central to the narrative. This case is about Sherri Herrera, a woman who lived, loved, raised children, and had her life stolen from her on a desolate highway on-ramp in 1993. A woman whose name deserves to be remembered, whose story deserves to be told, and whose family deserves justice. For 30 years, Sherri's children lived with the weight of their mother's unsolved murder. They grew up, built lives, maybe became parents themselves, all while carrying the burden of not knowing who killed their mother or why. They marked anniversaries of her death. They celebrated birthdays and holidays with an empty chair at the table. They wondered if they'd ever have answers, ever see justice, ever be able to move forward with some sense of closure. The arrest and conviction of Douglas Thomas doesn't erase those 30 years of pain. It doesn't bring Sherri back. It doesn't undo the childhood her children experienced without their mother, the milestones she missed, the grandchildren she'll never meet. But it does provide something crucial: accountability. The person responsible for their mother's death will face consequences. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will never again know freedom. And Sherri's family will know that her life mattered, that her death was taken seriously, that society valued her enough to never stop seeking justice. There are thousands of cold cases across America, thousands of families waiting for answers that may never come, thousands of victims whose murders remain unsolved, whose killers remain free, whose names are slowly being forgotten. Sherri's case reminds us that those cases matter. Those families matter. Those victims matter. And as long as evidence is preserved, as long as investigators remain dedicated, as long as forensic science continues to advance, there's hope. If you're listening to this and you have information about any unsolved case, any case at all, please come forward. You might think your information is insignificant, that it won't make a difference, that someone else has probably already reported it. But you could be wrong. Your tip could be the one that breaks the case. Your information could be the missing piece that investigators have been searching for. Your call could be what brings a family the closure they desperately need. Cold cases get solved because people care. Investigators who refuse to give up. Scientists who develop better techniques. Witnesses who come forward, even years later. Family members who keep their loved one's memory alive and keep pushing for answers. All of these people working together can accomplish what seems impossible. They can solve cases that have been cold for decades. They can bring killers to justice. They can provide answers to families who have been waiting a lifetime. Sherri Herrera's case is now part of a growing list of cold cases solved through modern forensic science and determined investigation. Her name joins those of other victims who finally received justice after years or decades of waiting. And her case provides hope. Hope that other cold cases can be solved. Hope that other families can get answers. Hope that justice, though sometimes delayed, is still possible. As we close this story, I want you to remember Sherri not as a case file or a victim, but as a person, a mother, a daughter, someone who mattered to her family and her community, someone whose life had value and whose death demanded justice. Because that's what every cold case really is. A person whose life was taken, whose death remains unresolved, whose family deserves answers. Thank you for listening to Sherri's story. Thank you for caring about a case that happened more than 30 years ago. Thank you for remembering that behind every cold case statistic is a real person who deserves justice. And if you have information about any unsolved case, please reach out to law enforcement. You might be the one who finally brings a family the answers they've been waiting for. With that said, thanks for listening. Until next time, remember, no case is ever truly cold as long as someone refuses to forget. Justice may be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied. And every victim, no matter how much time has passed, deserves to have their story told and their killer held accountable. Stay safe out there, and never stop seeking the truth.